From the U-boat's bridge, the North Atlantic looked empty. It was 1942, blacked-out night easing into a sickly gray dawn. A Type VII submarine ran on the surface, diesel engines thumping, bow knifing through icy swells. On the tiny bridge, wrapped in oilskins and salt spray. The watch officer scanned the horizon the way he had 100 times before, searching for the usual things that meant convoy. A thin line of mastheads, a smudge of smoke, a straight dark finger of funnel exhaust stabbing up into the sky. Instead, he saw a mistake. "Smoke to port," a lookout called softly. The officer turned his glasses that way and frowned. It wasn't right. The smoke, he saw, didn't stand up in a neat column over individual ships. It lay low, smeared across the surface like a dirty fog bank. No sharp outlines, no clean funnel traces, just a rough, rolling haze hugging the water. "Old weather, old convoy," he muttered. Maybe some ships had passed hours ago, leaving only scattered smoke and sea mist behind. Not worth chasing. He turned away and ordered the boat back on its patrol line. What he never knew was that he'd just turned his back on a live target, an entire Allied convoy crawling through that man-made fog bank. On the other side of that dirty gray wall, merchantmen and a few small escorts plowed along at 8 knots, almost invisible from outside. On the deck of one stubby little escort, a stocky man in a stained apron stood beside a filthy steel drum, stirring a burning mix of waste oil, galley grease, and seawater like it was a soup pot. He wasn't an officer. He wasn't a gunnery expert. He was the ship's cook, and his insane smoke trick had just convinced a U-boat to sail right past them. To understand what that cook was really doing, you have to understand how deadly smoke usually was in the Battle of the Atlantic. On maps in London, the war at sea was colored in neat lines and convoy codes, HX, SC, on, small clusters of ships inching across a blue ocean. Out on the water, it felt more like walking slowly through a dark room while someone fired guns at the sound of your footsteps. Convoys were the lifeline. Tankers full of fuel, freighters full of grain, ammunition, aircraft parts, trucks, everything Britain needed to stay in the fight. They moved at the speed of the slowest ship, which often meant 8 knots on a good day, less in bad weather. Around them, like sheepdogs, ran the escorts. Destroyers if they were lucky, corvettes and armed trawlers if they weren't. U-boats hunted them like wolves. Before radar and long-range aircraft really took over the Atlantic, a lot of that hunting was done by eye. U-boat lookouts stood in the wind and spray, scanning for tiny details. A straight line of mastheads just peeking over the horizon, the faint glint of sunlight on steel, or a vertical smear of darkness. Smoke from a ship's funnel. Smoke was the easiest thing to see. Every ship made it. Boilers burned fuel oil. Engines ran hot and dirty. Even galleys added their own little plumes when cooks fired up stoves for bread and stew. In clear air, you didn't need to see the ship itself. The smoke pointed to it like a black finger. Convoy officers knew this. They'd curse when the funnels started belching thicker smoke, order the engine room to adjust the mix, sometimes even limit cooking during high-risk hours. Official smoke screens, deliberate walls of smoke, were something destroyers and bigger warships laid under careful orders, using special generators and chemicals, usually to cover turns or retreats. Small escorts like Mac's ship didn't have much of that. They had old engines, thin hulls, maybe one tired radar set that only worked when the sea wasn't too rough, and a cook who was constantly told, "Keep the smoke down, Mac, you're giving us away." From where he stood by his galley vent, watching nervous officers stare at every dark puff from the funnels, he began to wonder if everyone was looking at this the wrong way. If U-boats were already steering by smoke, what would happen if you changed what that smoke looked like? The run that changed Mac's thinking didn't start out any different from the others. The Convoy was one of the slow ones, a plodding chain of merchant ships strung out across a heaving gray sea, 8 knots at best. The escorts were small and tired, their paint scoured by salt, their crews running on bad sleep and worse coffee. Mac was below, in the galley, fighting with a pot of stew that wouldn't thicken. "Galley, bridge," the voice crackled over the voice pipe. "Cool it on the smoke, Mac. Funnels look like a blasted factory. Captain's not happy." He glanced at the vent. Sure enough, his stoves were adding their own greasy signature to the ship's exhaust, blending into a thin, darker band trailing astern. He turned down the burners with a sigh. Fewer hot meals, more hard biscuits, all because of smoke. Hours later, the light went strange. The flat, metallic glow that meant evening was coming on. Somewhere ahead in the convoy, a signal lamp blinked. Word filtered back, a U-boat contact report. Tension spiked, men spoke in lower voices, moved a little faster. Then, night fell, and the wolves came. It started with distant flashes, white plumes as torpedoes hit ships near the front of the column. A few seconds later, the dull thump of explosions reached Mac in the galley. Sirens wailed, boots thudded overhead. Someone yelled, "They've got the tanker!" Mac raced up to a gun deck and saw it. A ship ahead, already listing, black smoke pouring into the sky. Somewhere beyond the edge of vision, more U-boats were homing in, running on the surface, using the convoy's own smoke band as their guide. Later in the mess, men cursed the damn smoke that had betrayed them. Orders came down again. Keep the exhaust clean. Keep the galleys quiet. No unnecessary burning. Mac stared at the coffee in his mug and thought about that long, dark ribbon in the sky. If the U-boats were following smoke like a trail, maybe the trick wasn't to get rid of it. Maybe the trick was to make it lie. The breakthrough started, of all places, with Mac staring at trash. It was one of those rare, half-quiet days. No alarms, just cold wind and endless gray. Mac stepped out of the galley for a breath of air and leaned on the rail near the engine room vent. Wisps of exhaust curled up, then flattened and tore away in the crosswind. Closer to him, his own cooking smoke puffed out of a vent and drifted low, clinging to the deck before sliding over the side. That caught his eye. When the air was damp and heavy, the galley's smoke didn't climb. It hugged the ship like a dirty blanket, then rolled along the surface of the water before thinning out. Later, he overheard 2 officers talking near the bridge. Burning rich to lay smoke, that's what they did off Crete. Destroyers made their own fog bank for miles. "Yeah, well, we're not exactly a destroyer, are we?" the other replied. "We're lucky if the boilers stay lit." Burning rich, making their own fog. Mac went back to the galley, mind spinning. They didn't have fancy smoke generators or drums of chemical smoke, but they did have something else in endless supply. Waste, grease from pans, sludge from the fuel filters, oily rags, splintered wood, junk no one wanted. On the next dog watch, with the sea a little calmer, he quietly dragged an old steel drum onto the aft deck. He half-filled it with whatever would burn, thick and dirty. Waste oil from the engine room, ladles of old deep-fry grease, soaked canvas, even a bucket of seawater to keep it from burning too clean and hot. He wedged bits of scrap metal around it as crude baffles to control the airflow. Then, when no one was looking too closely, he lit it. The result was immediate and ugly. A roiling, dark smoke poured out, not straight up, but heavy and sluggish. The cold, damp air grabbed it and pressed it down. The ship's wake and the wind pulled it aft, where it spread into a low, dirty ribbon just above the waves. From the deck, it looked like they were towing a piece of storm cloud. Of course, someone noticed. "Mac, what in blazes are you doing, trying to roast the whole convoy?" the coxswain shouted, coughing as the smoke blew back over the rail. Mac waved him over. "Look at it from here," he insisted. "Not from right on top. Look aft." Reluctantly, the man followed him to the stern and peered along the wake. Out there, the smoke band stretched on and on, low and thick, obscuring the view of the convoy columns behind them. "If we do this when we turn," Max said quietly, "we can drag a wall of muck between us and where the U-boats think we're going. They see smoke, sure, but not ships. And if the wind's right, maybe they chase the cloud and not us." It sounded crazy. It smelled worse. But on a sea where men were dying over tiny advantages, crazy suddenly seemed worth a test. The first real test came on a night when nobody was in the mood for experiments. The convoy was somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, days from land in any direction. The weather had turned foul. Low clouds, chopped up seas, visibility shrinking and stretching with every squall. It was the kind of night U-boats liked. Enough darkness to hide in, enough breaks in the cloud to see smoke. Word came down late in the second dog watch, a signal from shore stations and long-range aircraft. Wolfpack reported ahead, strung out across their intended track. On the little escort where Mac worked, the captain and his officers pored over charts in a cramped cabin. A quiet course alteration was agreed, a few degrees off the planned line, nothing dramatic, just enough to make any U-boats plotting a little bit wrong. Then the lieutenant who'd watched Mac's earlier stunt cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, "we might have a way to confuse the picture. The cook's been playing with a smoke drum." The captain stared at him like he'd suggested flying the ship to Canada. But after a few minutes of questions and a weary glance at the casualty lists from previous convoys, he gave a tight nod. "Fine, one try. If it blinds us more than them, it goes over the side." Mac got the word with very little explanation. Drum, aft now. He went to work. On the stern, he set up his steel drum, lashed it down, and fed it like a monster. Waste oil, greasy rags, old galley fat, chunks of scrap wood. A sailor rigged a small blower from the engine room to push air into the base. Mac struck a match, shielded it from the wind, and touched it to the mess. The drum coughed, spat, then roared to life. Thick, tarry smoke boiled out, but instead of climbing high, it rolled low and heavy over the deck edge, slumping onto the sea. The wind and wake seized it, dragging it back and sideways. Within minutes, a dirty gray wall began to form astern, spreading across the convoy's trail like spilled ink. "Execute turn," came the order. Inside that growing haze, the convoy shifted a few degrees, dozens of ships nudging onto the new course, while the smoke ribbon kept stretching along the old one, like a ghost convoy continuing straight ahead. Miles away, a U-boat running on the surface picked up the first sign. "Smoke band, bearing green 5, the lookout called. The captain raised his glasses. He saw what he expected. a long swipe of darkness against the horizon. But the details were wrong. No clear mastheads, no sharp funnels, just a low, irregular fog. "Probably old exhaust and weather," he said at last. "No point diving on ghosts." He ordered the boat to adjust slightly, to intercept where the old course would have taken the ships. By the time the wolf pack realized there was nothing solid inside that smoke, the real convoy, hidden just to one side of their expectations, was already creeping past in the dark. On Mac's escort, the drum finally sputtered low. His arms ached from stirring and feeding it. He didn't know yet that somewhere out in the night, a U-boat had sailed confidently toward a wall of lies he'd cooked up in a battered steel barrel. He just knew one thing. No torpedoes had come their way. What happened next didn't look like a revolution. It looked like gossip. In the days and weeks after that crossing, the escort's after-action report mentioned use of improvised smoke to confuse enemy visual bearings. It was one line in a stack of paperwork. No one underlined improvised. No one wrote idea courtesy of ship's cook. But sailors talk faster than paper travels. In mess decks and dockside pubs, men from that convoy told the story of the run where we dragged a smoke carpet and the U-boats missed everything. Some called it nonsense, a lucky night and bad weather. Others listened a little closer, picturing the low wall of smoke and the quiet course change inside it. On other small escorts, cooks and stokers began tinkering with their own versions. Drums on deck, waste oil in buckets, boilers run a bit richer when the air was heavy and damp. Officers folded these tricks into existing smoke doctrine, pairing improvised galley plumes with official smoke floats and standard maneuvering plans. There was never a formal order reading, "Adopt Mac's method." No textbook diagrams of a cook with a drum. Instead, his idea dissolved into the general toolbox of the Atlantic War. One more way to make the enemy's picture just wrong enough. When the war finally eased off, Mac didn't go home as the man who fooled a wolf pack. He went home as what his papers said he was: ship's cook, Atlantic convoys, campaigns served. He swapped steel decks for wooden floors, the crash of waves for the hiss of a cafe fryer or the clatter of a factory canteen. Maybe, on some evening years later, someone asked about the war, and he told the story in pieces. How one night they burned garbage in a drum, and a whole pack of U-boats seemed to just miss. Most people probably laughed. It sounded too small to matter. But out on the Atlantic, on that one night, a few degrees of course change, and one man's ugly smoke had nudged history a fraction of an inch. A fraction big enough for his convoy to survive. Stories like Mac's remind us that World War II wasn't only shaped by admirals' plans or secret codes. It was also nudged here and there by people no one ever wrote down, cooks, mechanics, signalmen, who looked at a familiar problem and tried something that felt a little crazy. What you've just heard is built on real convoy conditions, real U-boat hunting methods, and real smoke tactics. But some names, dialogue, and moments are dramatized to bring the history to life. For serious research, always turn to professional historians and archives. If you want more forgotten World War II stories like this, help keep them alive. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if anyone in your family ever shared a strange little trick from their time at sea,